We have with us this evening Dr. Darren Oldridge from the University of Worcester, who has written a series of fascinating studies in this area. For example, the devil in Tudor and Stuart England. I asked him actually the way down from the Learning Resources Centre, is Old Nick going to figure in your talk? And I said, well, a bit perhaps, but that's a different talk really. The witchcraft reader, and at present he's working on the supernatural in early modern England. So could you please give a warm welcome to Dr. Darren Oldridge.
Now, my interest in fairies really germinated about a year ago when I visited in Sheffield a beautiful old house that had on display a cradle which had been sprinkled with garlic and salt. And apparently the garlic and the salt had been sprinkled on the cradle in order to protect the infant from attack by fairies and other dark spirits in the period from its birth until its baptism. Which made me think about the interesting, shadowy relationship between fairy beliefs and Christianity. And also, for some time, I have been intrigued by what some 17th century English writers described as doubtful spirits. And what I mean by doubtful spirits is those creatures that were clearly not angels, but were not obviously demons either. And in the next half hour or so, I want to speak in very general terms about some of these doubtful spirits which appear to have scuttled in the corners of Elizabethan and Tudor England, and the relationship between these anomalous, undesirable things and official forms of religion. And inevitably, when pursuing such an elusive quarry, there are gaps and elisions in what I'm going to say, and I'll be very interested in your responses, your questions, and any enlightenment that you can bring at the end of what I hope will be a fairly brief and snappy presentation. We shall see. In 1584, the English demonologist Reginald Scott presented a marvellous catalogue of monsters that he claimed populated the tales that maidservants told to young children. These included witches, fairies and imps, as well as an array of exotic and extraordinary terrestrial spirits. The man in the oak, the hellwain, the fire drake, the puckle, Tom Thumb, hobgoblin, Tom Tumbler and boneless. Scott also named the will-o'-the-wisp spirit, Kit with the candlestick, the lascivious incubus demon, and the mare, a creature that paralysed and smothered sleepers in their beds. These terrors, he suggested, made such an impression on young minds that they lurked in the recesses of adult consciousness. They could make men tremble to walk at night when spirits might appear as animals or be heard in the shrieks of owls. Now, it seems to me that Scott's catalogue of bugs cannot be taken at face value. For a start, he included creatures from classical mythology that seemed to be improbable visitors to English villages. He also borrowed the incubus demon from continental texts that featured prominently in his critique of contemporary demonology. As Timothy Scott McGuinness has argued, Scott was mainly interested in entering a learned debate with other writers on witchcraft, rather than addressing directly the religious ideas of ordinary people. Nor did he see himself as an archivist of folk beliefs. Nonetheless, I think his compendium of monsters should be taken seriously for a couple of reasons. First, the bugs he identified were not merely rhetorical, though he undoubtedly added some names to fatten the list. Creatures like the mare and the puckle were recorded in other contemporary texts and appear to be authentic inhabitants of the popular world of spirits. The activities of fairies, hobgoblins and imps, as well as roaming spirits such as Kit with the Candlestick, were also well attested in the 16th century. Thus I think Scott presents an interesting overview of the bogies of the late Tudor imagination, though one that cannot, of course, be taken completely uncritically. Secondly, the fate of Scott's bugs indicates the wider effects of the Protestant Reformation. Scott presented his assembly of monsters as part of the larger argument of his book, that the fear of witchcraft was a delusion encouraged by Catholicism, and its remedy was the preaching of the unsullied Word of God. The presence of bugs in people's imagination was a marker of the success or the failure of this project. And Scott was generally, I think, optimistic. In the preface to the Discovery, he noted boldly that the hobgoblin Robin Goodfellow ceaseth now to be so much feared, and he hoped that one day most people would regard the fear of witches as equally foolish. Elsewhere, in parts of the text, he was less sanguine. For instance, he began his account of how people have been brought to fear bugs by stating that the causes have only been partly reformed by the preaching of the gospel. Some groundless anxieties about goblins and walking spirits remained, but he hoped that those illusions will in short term be God's grace, be detected and vanish away. I've never been taught how to drink from a bottle in public, so I'm going to improvise. So, what became of Scott's bugs? Broadly, I think they were ignored by the authorities of early modern England and maintained a shadowy presence at the margin of acceptable belief. English Protestants mostly dismissed their existence, but there was no campaign to abolish or to reclassify them. Unlike the cult of saints, they had not played a central role in medieval Christianity, and unlike ghosts, they were not associated with the discredited doctrine of purgatory. Consequently, their expulsion from the supernatural world was a low priority. Official responses to the reported activity of these spirits emerged, I think, on an ad hoc basis and depended largely on the attributes of the entities themselves and the circumstances in which they appeared. The fate of the bugs is illustrated by the various spirits in Scott's list that can be classed broadly as fairies. As well as fairies themselves, these included will-o'-the-wisps, hobgoblins and elves. These creatures appear only passingly in the written sources of the period. They belonged to an oral culture that could not, by its nature, be preserved for future historians. The surviving records suggest considerable fluidity between various fairy forms. This was shown in the cluster of creatures known as puckles or pucks. In one persistent tradition, Pucks were believed to be spirits that led travellers astray at night, also known as will-o'-the-wisps or jack-o'-lanterns. The hobgoblin Robin Goodfellow was usually included among them. He appeared in this role in William Tyndale's commentary on the first epistle of St. John in 1531, and in tales circulating in the late 16th and the early 17th centuries. But Robin also entered houses to steal cream, rather like a domestic fairy. In the 1590s, of course, he provided the basis for Shakespeare's mischievous spirit named Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in another context, Puckles or Puckrills were identified as malicious spirits in allegations of witchcraft. Despite these overlapping identities, several broad characteristics were ascribed to English fairies. They tended to live at the margins of human habitation, usually on hilltops or in marshes and woods. They could interact with mortals and possessed the power to heal sickness and locate hidden things. And they could enter homes to steal food or receive gifts from their inhabitants. Physically, they appeared in various forms, often as adult humans, but also as animals or as walking fires. And this reflected the pleasure they seemed to take in deception. In colloquial language, fairy gold was an illusion, and fairy trappings were decorations that tricked the eye. In their deeds, fairies were unpredictable. They could help men and women, especially in domestic work, and they took small gifts in return. But they could also punish those to whom they took offence, particularly slovenly housekeepers. They could also attack or torment unfortunate mortals, leaving them very pinched or haunted with fairies. As will-o'-the-wisps, they guided the unwary into remote and treacherous places or abandoned them in bogs. Numerous sources suggest a continued and indeed a lively interest in fairies throughout the early modern period. For a start, there was a demand for medicines for the various afflictions that they were believed to cause. In his herbal The Garden of Health, published in 1597, William Langham recommended bay oil soaked in a linen cloth as a treatment for fairy pinchers, and he advised parents to hang peony seeds around their children's necks to prevent the haunting of fairies and goblins. The astrological physician Richard Napier treated a patient troubled by fairies in 1608. More positively, Diane Purkis has noted the strong association between fairies and buried treasure. This led both scholarly magicians and village cunning folk to solicit their aid in uncovering riches, and also created opportunities for fraud. In the early 1590s, the scandalous career of Judith Phillips, who gulled and robbed a series of people by claiming that the fairy queen could lead them to hidden gold, illustrated the considerable allure of such arrangements. Sightings of fairies of various kinds continued throughout the period and were preserved in the collections of sort of early folklorists such as John Aubrey. Aubrey himself recalled that as a schoolboy in 1634 he searched for fairies on the Wiltshire Downs after hearing that his curate had been enchanted and pinched by a troop of dancing spirits. So people, it seems, continued to believe in fairies, and fairies, it seems, continued to manifest themselves. How then did the Reformation affect these beliefs? Mostly, it seems, they were left quietly alone. Unless they attracted the attention of religious or legal authorities, there was very little need to explain or to reclassify the spirits concerned. The belief in will-o'-the-wisps provides a good example. as false lights that led the unwary from the true path, these creatures were comparable to the devil. There he is. And this likeness was often exploited in literature. In Paradise Lost, for example, Milton compared Satan to a wandering fire that misleads the amazed night wanderer from his way to bogs and mires. Outside such figurative contexts, however, very little was written on such apparitions. In the English translation of his treatise on spirits in 1572, Ludwig Lavater explained them largely as natural phenomena, though he noted that they might sometimes be demons. The psychologist Robert Burton classed them as walking devils in 1621. Towards the end of the 17th century, will-o'-the-wisps were mentioned as curiosities in Compendia of Natural History, where they were explained variously as luminous insects or vapours produced by marshy ground. In the absence of a campaign to discredit their existence, or any official context that required their explanation, will-o'-the-wisps were untouched by the religious reforms of the Tudor and Stuart period. At the same time, the related character of Robin Goodfellow appears to have migrated from popular belief into the pages of jocular fiction. A pamphlet in 1588 noted that Robin was famous in every old wives' tale for his mad, merry pranks. Several of these were printed in a jest book in 1628, and Robin also appeared in quite a few comic ballads printed in the early 1600s. I'll have another go at sipping from the bottle. And by the end of this presentation, I hope to have achieved elegance with this art. We shall see. In the surviving printed texts about Robin Goodfellow, at least, he appears as a mischievous but essentially good-hearted spirit, addicted to deception, but always willing to help those that suffered wrong. In this capacity, he assisted two lovers whose union was prevented by a lecherous uncle, and he punished a publican who defrauded his customers. In a ballad in 1648, he disguised himself as a horse in order to teach a lesson to some thieves, whom he rode through filthy water, earth and mire when they attempted to steal him. These comic turns appeared to coincide with his decline as a figure in English folk belief, which Reginald Scott had already observed in 1584. While some fairy beliefs were ignored by the authorities or receded into popular entertainment, others provoked more serious concern. But this was sporadic. Cunning folk were occasionally examined by the courts in connection to magical practices involving fairies. Famously, this was the case with the Dorset magician John Walsh, who admitted in 1566 to consulting with fairies to discover the victims of bewitchment. A Leicestershire cunning woman, Joan Willimot, employed a fairy for the same purpose, according to a pamphlet published in 1619. Research. For instance, each spirit had to be conjured by name, and some spells depended on detailed understanding of the geography of spirits. The recipe for an unguent to be appointed to the eyes required thyme gathered near the side of a hill where fairies used to be, and the grass of a fairy throne. Ashmole addressed by name the fairies that he sought to bind. These included Ellaby Gaffon, whom he commanded to give true obedience in a long and carefully contractual conjuration. He also acknowledged that fairies were employed by other magicians. Indeed, he noted that attempts to call and subjugate such spirits would work only if they were not already bound. The activities of another class of spirits aroused wider attention and received more scrutiny from churchmen and lawyers. These were the noxious creatures allegedly employed by witches to torment their neighbours. Such bugs appeared in early accounts of English witchcraft from the 1560s and retained a prominent role in allegations throughout the 17th century. Their origins and identity remain unclear. Those Protestant writers that accepted their existence tended to class them as familiar spirits or demons, though they were careful to point out that their behaviour did not conform to the biblical account of Satan. Villagers fearful of witches' spirits may have understood them as a species of malicious fairy, or imp. The Essex minister, George Gifford, referred to a witch's spirit as a puckrill in a treatise published in 1587. 6 years later, a character in his dialogue concerning witches and witchcrafts described an old woman who kept 3 or 4 imps and noted that some call them puckrills. In Ben Jonson's unfinished play The Sad Shepherd, a familiar spirit is also named Puckheary. The creature reveals its true nature in a soliloquy. It is a demon that both deceives and protects its mistress, and sometimes dances about the forest like a goblin. The terms puckrill and imp were used only rarely in the judicial records of English witchcraft before 1645, but in that year the depositions of several witches apprehended in Suffolk referred to harmful spirits as imps. Whatever they were, it is clear that these creatures had several qualities that distinguished them from ordinary fairies. They normally took the form of small animals, they suckled from teats concealed on their owners' bodies, and they obeyed their commands. Most pertinently for those that encountered them, they were always malevolent. These malignant creatures remained a tenacious, if somewhat anomalous, presence throughout the early modern period. Many educated writers followed Scott in dismissing them as figments of the superstitious imagination. Others, more cautiously, retained the possibility that demons might masquerade as small creatures to prosecute their designs, though this interpretation required, I think, a good deal of ingenuity. George Gifford viewed the involvement of imps in allegations of harmful sorcery as evidence of popular folly. He mocked the belief that the devil lies in a pot of wool, soft and warm, and stirs not but when he is hired and sent. Nonetheless, he acknowledged that evil spirits could assume bodily shapes in order to deceive the unwary. In 1627, Richard Bernard, the godly minister of Batcombe in Somerset, attempted to combine continental demonology with reports of witches' imps. He argued that the teat at which witches suckled their spirits was a devil's mark by which he sealed a formal compact with his servants. Such ideas allowed some churchmen to accept the activity of imps within the framework of satanic witchcraft, but they remained extremely problematic. In 1646, for example, the Cambridgeshire minister John Gall listed testimony concerning imps among the factors that made witch trials an uncertain and dangerous business. Let's try again. I'm gathering confidence, and I think boys. Thank you. Now, witches' imps were related to another of Reginald Scott's bugs, the cluster of night terrors known collectively as the hag or the mare. Typically, the victims of this phenomenon experienced a kind of waking dream, attended by feelings of dread and sometimes frightening visions also. They also suffered paralysis and a sense of suffocating pressure on their chests. Scott himself explained the condition in medical terms. though he noted that others believed it had supernatural origins. Consequently, he observed that its victims sometimes slept with protective charms above their beds. It appears that the mare was sometimes attributed to night-coming fairies. The Robin Goodfellow jest book in 1628 featured a fairy named Gull that ventured out when mortals keep their beds and delighted in causing nocturnal distress. Many times, the creature boasts, I get on men and women, and so lie on their stomachs that I cause great pain, for which they call me by the name of the hag or nightmare. More often, however, attacks of this kind were associated with witchcraft. In these cases, the spirits involved did not act independently, but apparently at the behest of human associates. In 1579, Richard Gallis of Windsor ascribed a series of night terrors to the activities of local witches. The first of these episodes was especially dramatic. Suddenly, about 12 o'clock in the night, a shadow of a huge and mighty black cat appeared in my chamber, which the more as she approached near my bedside, so much the more began my hair to stand upright, my heart to faint, and my pains more and more to increase. This creature menaced Gallus so often that he took to lying awake in prayer with a dagger by his side. Another monstrous cat was described in 1599 in the deposition of Olive Barthram, who was tormented by a witch in the Suffolk village of Stradbroke. This spirit awoke its victim in bed and then pressed her so sore that she could not speak, and at other times he held her hands that she could not stir and restrained her voice that she could not speak. An anonymous manuscript from the reign of Charles I reiterated the connection between witchcraft and the mare. This described how the victim of the night spirit took magical revenge on his attacker. He rose early in the morning and urinated into a chamber pot, and then worked a charm over its contents. This caused the witch responsible to visit him and complain of a grief in her bladder and that she could not piss. Now, as Owen Davies has observed, the symptoms of the mare are recognised today in the medical condition known as sleep paralysis disorder. Indeed, based on the numbers here tonight, I'm fairly confident that some of you will have experienced sensations very similar to those that I've just described. Though it's unlikely that you responded by charming a chamber pot. The physical effects of the syndrome have remained constant across time and cultures, but their interpretation has reflected the assumptions of sufferers and the communities to which they belonged. Even in Tudor and Stuart England, multiple explanations were available. Some shared Scott's belief that the mare was a natural malady, while others viewed it as the work of fairies or witches. When bewitchment was suspected, the attacks were often attributed to imps, but in some cases these creatures were believed to be wicked angels in disguise. Richard Gallis, for example, and rather ostentatiously, believed that the thing that attacked him was the devil himself in a cat's likeness. A view consistent with his self-image as a Christian assailed by the satanic enemy. The experience of the mare, therefore, indicates the various interpretive models available to early modern people. It could be perceived as a fairy, a witch's imp, a satanic incursion, or a physical illness. Other creatures in Scott's collection of bugs made fleeting appearances in the records of early modern England. The man in the oak may be related to the spirit that lived in a hollow tree in George Gifford's Dialogue on Witchcraft in 1593. This entity was introduced by the character Daniel, who represented in the text the opinions of an untutored countryman. Daniel bestowed the creature the role and the powers of a witch's imp. It spoke to its mistress from the tree and menaced her neighbours at her command. When she was offended with any, she went to that tree and sent him to kill their cattle. These claims produced a memorably withering response from Gifford's spokesman in the dialogue. Do you think that Satan lives in a hollow tree? Has he become so idle and lazy? Has he left off to be as a roaring lion, seeking those whom he may devour? Whatever the provenance of this creature, tree spirits of this kind do not appear to feature prominently in later accounts of English witchcraft. Another of Scott's monsters, the fire drake, maintained a presence in the 17th century. The fire drake was originally a kind of fire-breathing serpent, but could also appear as a burning fire in the air. In his History of Serpents, 1608, Edward Topsell described a sighting of such a fireball by fishermen on the Cornish coast, reported to him some 12 years earlier. While Topsell regarded the moving flame as a natural phenomenon, it was clearly a sign of a worldly significance by the ship's master. There came by them a fire drake, at the sight whereof the old man began to be much troubled and afraid, telling his servants that these sights seldom portended any good, and therefore prayed God to turn away all evil from them, and withal willed his servants to take up their nets, lest they did all repent it afterwards. For he said he had known much evil to follow such apparitions. And this apprehension, as it turned out, was well founded, as soon afterwards the master was robbed and murdered by his crew. Writing in the 1630s, the pious lawyer William Austin took a more naturalistic view of fire drakes. Like one of the wisps, he observed they were mere exuberances of nature. In his dictionary of 1658, Edward Phillips echoed this scientific explanation by defining a fire drake as a fiery meteor engendered of a hot exhalation inflamed between two clouds. The fire drake, like the other monsters in Scott's compendium, appears to have persisted quietly in the hinterland of early modern belief. Ignored and unreformed by the leaders of Protestant orthodoxy, except when they intruded on public affairs in cases of witchcraft, they remained an anomalous but largely uncontroversial presence in English culture. Whether they lost their power to unnerve the unwary visitor to marshlands, forests and remote hills remains an open question. It may be that the goblins, pucks and imps of traditional belief continued to skitter in the dark places and nightmares of English communities long into the age of reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. That's fascinating. You suggested at the beginning that you anticipated a discussion of some of these questions. Could we turn now to the floor, please, to take any questions or comments that you have in response to what Darren has just sketched or outlined for us?
You mentioned black cat, but I wondered if you'd come across in the 16th and 17th century literature any reference to the black dog, which in 18th, 19th century literature is quite common. Hardy is a very good example. And in the southwest, particularly on the Wiltshire, Somerset border, there are a number of place names still called Black Dog, like Black Dog Hill outside Warminster.
Yeah.
Does that feature in the 16th and 17th century at all?
It does, fleetingly. The black dog is associated with the part of the country I come from, in fact, because in Bungay, in is it Norfolk or Suffolk, I these tracks in Suffolk, the black dog actually murdered, allegedly, a man in the parish church, according to a pamphlet published in 1577. I'm quite attracted to Alexander Walsham's interpretation of this particular regional spirit and others like it, because what may have happened in this case was that during a dreadful thunderstorm at a time of religious anxiety occasioned by divisions within the congregation, some people reported seeing something dreadful in the church. What's interesting is the way that they interpreted what they saw seems to have been established by local tradition. So the black dog becomes, in Fleming's retelling, a kind of providential visitation of the devil taking the form of a black dog. But why a black dog? I mean, I think it's a black dog because of the myth of Old Chuck, which was circulating long before the Reformation. And I suspect that that was fairly typical of Protestant appropriations or attempted appropriations of these folkloric monsters. What's interesting is that they remain very similar to the creatures that you can read about in the period before the Reformation. And from what you say about Harley, I don't know the texts, they seem to have persisted pretty much in a similar guise subsequently. So Protestant interpreters are kind of saving the phenomenon by placing it within a more or less acceptable theological framework. But the substrata of folk belief remain pretty strong nonetheless.
Thank you.
I know this talk's been on early modern fairies, but I was wondering if you know much or know any sources on medieval fairies, because all I can find out about medieval fairies is mostly romances where they show up.
I'm immensely ignorant, and my ignorance grows every year. Sadly, I'm not a medievalist, and I think it would be presumptuous to attempt to answer your question, because I really don't know the texts. I could only respond with generalities that you could find for yourself, and with which you are already familiar, and you would smile kindly and listen to me. But I don't think I can actually add a great deal to what others have written much more expertly than myself on fairies of the Middle Ages. So I'm sorry to disappoint.
No answer to that, really. So.
That's the question. I mean, this isn't really a subject I work on particularly, but there's a very sort of well-documented, it's sort of like a witchcraft case from the 17th century Rye, which has been published by Annabel Gregory.
Yeah.
Did you know it's sort of Rye spirits? But I haven't looked at all the sort of primary sources associated with it, but some of them were sort of published in Sussex archaeological collections in the 19th century. And what struck me in that case, it's very, very complicated. It goes on and on and on. But there seemed to be an ambiguity about the status of these spirits, because in some respects they were depicted as both fairies and as ghosts.
Yeah.
I noticed a similar ambiguity in ballads, which you've commented on when I've been trawling through ballads or other sources. And it sometimes seems to be that ambiguity is often sort of associated with how they're sort of depicted physically, wearing things that, sort of a crude ballad would cut, which appear to be shroud-like. They appear to be dressed in white. And I wondered whether you could kind of comment on that, and particularly you were saying your sort of spirits seem to be accepted in a Protestant world, whereas of course ghosts in theory are not, because there's no longer that relationship with purgatory. But have you come across that?
I think my spirits are largely ignored in a Protestant world, which is not the same as accepted. But yeah, the thing about fairies is they're deceptive, and demons are deceptive too, and that quality makes them quite useful to Protestant thinkers who are trying to explain manifestations of such doubtful spirits when sort of drinking too much, or bad spectacles, or priests dressing in sheets don't seem to suffice. They are murky and ambiguous, I think. You're right. And the status of these creatures seems to me to be fluid. I mean, I talked a little bit about that in the context of this collection of beliefs assembled around Puck, or is it Robin Goodfellow, or is it one of the Wisp, or is it Puck Rules? It's not clear, but they seem to be shifting. They seem to be anomalous by their nature. And annoyingly, but tantalisingly, so much of what we know through the filter of educated folk who happen to write down traces of these things. I know, for instance, that astonishingly, in Elias Ashmole's conjurations of fairies, he actually addresses one of them as a Christian. He refers to it as a fellow Christian creature, and that will be judged at the last day alongside himself. So these things seem remarkably fluid. In their representation, again, I'm thinking of the ballad literature and the woodcuts that were attached to ballads, often only very loosely related to the ballads and often recycled. And I've come across similar things. I think it's more common with ghosts, perhaps, than with fairies, but in the ghost ballads you sometimes see figures in sheets and the devil beside the figure in sheets, so it could be a ghost, it could be the devil, it's not entirely clear. With fairies, they sometimes look like wild men. You know, some of the Robin Goodfellow ballads look like sort of wild men of the forests. It's a complicated way of saying I don't know, but they're slippery. That's one thing that does seem to be the case.
But that ambivalence, I suppose, is part of their role in popular culture, is that you can attach different meanings to them in different contexts.
I think that's absolutely right. And because they're not only slippery, but one of their qualities is deceit. So they're slippery creatures that pretend to be other kinds of things. So yes, they are remarkably hard to apprehend at 300 years distance. And I suspect even in the period they're very hard for people like Scott to apprehend.